Richard Thompson was having another ordinary day in his extraordinary life. At 54 years old, he'd built an empire that most people could only dream about. His company had changed the way people shopped online, and the profits had made him wealthier than he ever imagined possible. Now his days were filled with meetings, deals, and decisions that could shift millions of dollars in seconds. That Thursday afternoon, Richard left his downtown office earlier than usual. A potential investor had canceled their lunch meeting at the last minute, and for once he had a free afternoon. As he drove his silver Mercedes through the tree-lined streets toward his home in the hills, he thought about maybe taking a swim in his pool or catching up on some reading. The mansion came into view as he rounded the final curve. 5 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, a pool, a tennis court, and gardens that looked like something out of a magazine. He'd bought it 8 years ago, right after his company went public. It was more house than one person needed, but it made a statement. Success had a look, and this was it. Richard pressed the button to open the gate and drove slowly up the long driveway. The afternoon sun made everything glow golden. His gardener had been there earlier in the week, and the lawn looked perfect. Every blade of grass was the same height, every hedge trimmed to exact specifications. He paid good money for perfection, and that's what he got. But then something caught his eye. Movement near the rose garden on the far side of the lawn. At first he thought maybe an animal had gotten onto the property, a deer perhaps, or someone's dog. But as his car rolled closer, Richard's foot instinctively hit the brake. It wasn't an animal, it was Grace, his housekeeper. But she wasn't standing or walking. She was on her hands and knees on the grass, and she was eating it. Actually pulling handfuls of lawn grass from the ground and putting it into her mouth. Richard's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. He blinked hard, thinking maybe the afternoon sun was playing tricks on his eyes. But no, it was real. Grace was chewing the grass slowly, her eyes closed like she was trying to savor something. Every few seconds she'd reach down, pull up another small handful and eat it. His first thought was that she must be sick. Maybe something was wrong with her mind. People didn't just eat grass unless something was seriously wrong. But as he sat there watching, not sure what to do, he noticed other things. The way her uniform hung loose on her body, the way her cheekbones seemed more pronounced than he remembered, the exhausted slump of her shoulders even as she knelt there. For almost 10 minutes, Richard sat frozen in his car, the engine still running, watching this scene that didn't make sense in his world. Grace never looked up, never noticed his car sitting there. She just kept eating the grass with slow, mechanical movements like she'd done this before. Finally, she stood up. She brushed the dirt off her knees and straightened her uniform. Then she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked around quickly, as if checking to make sure no one had seen her. The look on her face was something Richard had never seen before. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was shame mixed with something else. Desperation, maybe. Or resignation. Grace walked away toward the side entrance of the house, her steps careful and measured. She moved like someone trying very hard to maintain dignity even when everything inside them was falling apart. Richard waited until she disappeared from view before he finally drove forward and parked in his usual spot. He sat in the car for another few minutes, his mind racing. Grace had worked for him for 3 years. 3 years of her coming to his house 6 days a week, arriving before dawn and leaving late in the afternoon. 3 years of her cleaning his bathrooms, doing his laundry, preparing his meals when his private chef wasn't available. And in those 3 years, how much did he actually know about her? Richard tried to remember any personal conversation they'd had. Had he ever asked about her family? Her life outside these walls? Where she lived? What she did on her one day off? The honest answer made his stomach turn. He knew nothing. She was just there, like the furniture or the appliances. Efficient, quiet, reliable. He probably interacted more with his phone than he did with the woman who cleaned up after him every single day. Richard got out of the car and walked into the house through the front entrance. The cool air conditioning hit his face and everything looked exactly as it always did. Spotless floors, perfectly arranged furniture, fresh flowers in the vase on the entry table. Grace's work, all of it. The invisible labor that made his life comfortable. He heard sounds coming from upstairs. The vacuum cleaner running in one of the guest bedrooms. Grace was back to work doing what she always did. Like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just been outside eating grass from his lawn because of something so terrible that his mind couldn't quite wrap around it yet. Richard walked into his study and closed the door. He sat down in his leather chair, the one that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and put his head in his hands. The image kept playing in his mind. Grace on her knees. Grace eating grass. Grace with that look on her face. Why would someone eat grass? The question kept circling in his brain. There was only one answer that made sense, and it was an answer he didn't want to believe. Not in his house. Not someone who worked for him. But the truth was sitting there, unavoidable and ugly. She was hungry. Not just a little hungry. Not ice-skipped lunch hungry. She was hungry enough to eat grass from a lawn. Hungry enough to risk looking foolish or crazy if someone saw her. That kind of hunger meant something much worse than Richard wanted to think about. He opened his laptop and pulled up his household accounts. Grace was paid $15 an hour, 48 hours a week. No benefits, no health insurance, no paid vacation days. She was classified as an independent contractor, which his household manager had explained was more cost-effective than making her a regular employee. At the time, Richard had just nodded and signed off on it. He'd never thought about what those numbers meant for the person actually living on them. He did the math. After taxes, Grace was taking home less than $30,000 a year. In a city where the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment was nearly $2,000 a month. Where gas prices were high and food costs kept climbing. Where one medical emergency could wipe out months of savings. Richard had spent more than $30,000 on his last vacation. He'd dropped that much on a watch without thinking twice about it. His monthly wine budget was probably more than Grace made in 2 months. The numbers stared back at him from the screen, cold and factual. They told a story he'd been too blind to see, or maybe too comfortable to look at. Upstairs, the vacuum cleaner turned off. Richard heard Grace's footsteps in the hallway, light and quick, always moving efficiently from one task to the next. Tomorrow morning, she'd be back before sunrise, making his coffee and preparing his breakfast. She'd smile politely if they passed in the hallway. She'd say yes, sir, and no, sir, and remain invisible in the way that made his life easy. But Richard knew he couldn't let tomorrow be like every other day. He couldn't unsee what he'd seen. He couldn't go back to comfortable ignorance. Tomorrow morning, he'd do something he'd never done before. He'd sit down with Grace and ask her a simple question. Not about his schedule or what he wanted for dinner. He'd ask her how she was really doing. And this time, he'd actually listen to the answer. Even if that answer broke his heart. Richard didn't sleep that night. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, watching shadows move across the room as clouds passed over the moon outside. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same thing. Grace on her knees eating grass from his lawn. The image wouldn't leave him alone. Around 3 a.m, he gave up on sleep completely. He went downstairs to his study and started researching something he'd never thought about before. What happens when people can't afford food? He read articles about food insecurity, about working poverty, about people who had jobs but still went hungry. The statistics were overwhelming. Millions of people working full-time jobs and still struggling to eat. It seemed impossible in a country this wealthy, but the numbers didn't lie. By the time the sun started rising, Richard had made a decision. He needed to talk to Grace, really talk to her. Not the polite small talk they'd exchanged for 3 years, but an actual conversation about what was happening in her life. He showered and dressed, then went downstairs to wait. Grace always arrived at 6 a.m, using the key he'd given her to let herself in through the side entrance. Richard made himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, something he never did. Usually he was already gone by the time Grace started her day, or he was upstairs in his bedroom keeping to his own space while she worked in his. At exactly 6 o'clock, he heard the side door open. Grace's footsteps were quiet in the hallway, and then she appeared in the kitchen doorway. When she saw him sitting there, she froze. Her eyes went wide with surprise and something else, fear maybe. "Or worry, Mr. Thompson," she said quickly, setting down her bag. "I'm sorry, I didn't know you'd be here. Do you need something? I can start the coffee right away, or if you want breakfast." "Grace, please sit down," Richard interrupted gently. He gestured to the chair across from him. She hesitated, looking confused and uncomfortable. In 3 years, they'd never sat down together. She stood and worked while he sat and lived. That was the unspoken rule. Having him ask her to sit felt like breaking some kind of law. "I really should start on the upstairs bathrooms," she said. "They take a while and I have the whole schedule planned out." "Please," Richard said again. Just for a few minutes. I need to talk to you. Grace moved slowly to the chair and sat down on the very edge like she might need to jump up and run at any moment. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and her shoulders were tense. She looked at him with those same tired eyes, waiting. Richard realized he didn't actually know how to start this conversation. How do you ask someone why they were eating grass without making it sound like an accusation? How do you admit that you've been blind to someone's suffering when they've been right in front of you for years? How long have you worked for me? He finally asked, even though he knew the answer. 3 years and 2 months, sir, Grace replied. Her voice was steady and professional, but he could hear the nervousness underneath. And in all that time, I don't think I've ever asked you the most basic question. How are you doing, Grace? How's your life? Something flickered across her face. Confusion, suspicion, maybe both. People in her position probably didn't get asked questions like that very often. They got told what to do, given instructions, handed lists of tasks. They didn't get asked how they were. I'm fine, Mr. Thompson, she said carefully. Thank you for asking. It was the answer he expected. The safe answer. The answer that kept boundaries in place and didn't cause problems. But Richard couldn't accept it this time. Not after what he'd seen. Grace, I was here yesterday afternoon. I came home early. The color drained from her face. She knew immediately what he was talking about. Her hands gripped each other tighter and she looked down at the table. I can explain, she said quickly, her voice shaking now. I wasn't stealing anything from your garden. I would never take anything that wasn't mine. I was just, why were you eating the grass, Grace? The question sat between them like a weight. Grace's shoulders started shaking, and when she looked up at him, tears were streaming down her face. She tried to wipe them away quickly with the back of her hand, tried to pull herself together, but the tears kept coming. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry you had to see that. It was stupid and desperate, and I promise it won't happen again. I'll understand if you want to let me go. I'll leave right now if you want. Just please, please don't tell anyone. I need the references if I'm going to find another job. Grace, I'm not firing you, Richard said. I just want to understand. Please, talk to me. She looked at him for a long moment like she was trying to decide if this was some kind of trap. Then something inside her seemed to break. The professional mask she'd been wearing for 3 years finally cracked. I was hungry, she said simply. I was so hungry I couldn't think straight anymore. And I saw the grass and I remembered reading somewhere that some grass is safe to eat and I couldn't help it. I was so hungry. The words hung in the air. Richard felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Hearing her say it out loud made it more real than anything he'd imagined during his sleepless night. When was the last time you ate a real meal? He asked quietly. Grace wiped her eyes again. Tuesday. I had some bread and peanut butter on Tuesday morning. Today was Friday. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. 3 days of coming to his house, cleaning his bathrooms, doing his laundry, while her stomach was empty and her body was slowly starving. Why didn't you tell me? Richard asked and immediately regretted it. It was such a stupid question. But Grace answered anyway. Tell you what, sir? That I can't make ends meet on what you pay me? That would just make you uncomfortable. And then you'd probably find someone else who wouldn't complain. That's how it works. People like me were replaceable. There's always someone else who needs the job badly enough to stay quiet about their problems. Her words cut deeper than Richard expected. She was right, and they both knew it. He'd never wanted to hear about his housekeeper's struggles. He'd wanted her to be invisible, to do her job efficiently, to not complicate his life with her problems. And she'd given him exactly what he wanted, even while she was suffering. I have 2 kids, Grace continued, her voice barely above a whisper now, 14 and 11. A girl and a boy. Their father died 4 years ago, left us with nothing but medical bills. I work here 6 days a week, and I thought that would be enough. I really thought it would be enough. But it's not, Richard said. No, sir, it's not. What happened? Why are things so bad right now? Grace took a shaky breath. My son got sick last month, real sick. Asthma attack in the middle of the night, couldn't breathe. I had to take him to the emergency room. We don't have insurance, so the bill was over $3,000. I had to pay it, or they were going to send it to collections, and I couldn't let that happen. So I paid the hospital instead of paying rent. Richard felt his chest tighten. You didn't pay rent? Couldn't, and the landlord doesn't care why. He gave me 3 days to get out. That was 3 weeks ago. Where are you living now? Grace looked down at her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her. In my car. Me and both kids. We've been sleeping in my car for 3 weeks, moving to different parking lots every night so nobody notices. The kids still go to school. They do their homework by flashlight. They don't complain because they know I'm doing everything I can. She looked up at him then, and the pain in her eyes was overwhelming. I feed them first. Mr. Thompson, always. Whatever food I can buy, they eat first. And if there's anything left, then I eat. Most days there's nothing left. So when I saw that grass yesterday and my stomach hurt so bad I could barely stand up, I just thought maybe it would help. Just a little bit. Just enough to make the pain stop. Richard couldn't speak. His throat was too tight, his chest too heavy. This woman had been starving. Her children had been homeless. And she'd still shown up here every single day at 6 in the morning, smiling politely, cleaning his house, making his life comfortable. "Why didn't you ask for help?" he finally managed to say. Grace gave him a sad smile. "Would you have helped, Mr. Thompson, really? Or would you have just been uncomfortable and found a reason to let me go?" He wanted to say yes, of course he would have helped. But the honest answer was that he didn't know. A week ago, he might have written her a check and patted himself on the back for being generous. But he never would have looked deeper at why she needed help in the first place. Now everything was different. Now he'd seen her eating grass. Now he knew the truth, and there was no going back. Richard sat back in his chair, feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath him. Grace was still sitting across from him, wiping tears from her face with the sleeve of her uniform. 3 weeks living in a car, 2 children doing homework by flashlight, a mother so hungry she'd eaten grass just to stop the pain in her stomach. "Grace," he said, his voice rough, "I want you to take today off. And tomorrow. And the rest of next week." Her head snapped up, panic flooding her eyes. "No, please, Mr. Thompson, I need this job." "I can't afford to miss work." "Please don't. You'll be paid," he interrupted quickly. "Full pay for the whole week. I just need you to do something for me. Take this." He pulled out his wallet and took out every bill inside. It wasn't much, maybe $400. He set it on the table and pushed it toward her. Grace stared at the money like it might disappear if she blinked. "I can't take that." "Yes, you can. You need it more than I do. But I didn't earn it. I didn't work for it." Richard stood up and walked to his study. He returned a minute later with his personal credit card and placed it next to the cash. Grace looked at it like he'd put a snake on the table. "What is this?" she whispered. "I want you to take your kids and get a hotel room. A decent one. Get them some real food. Hot meals, whatever they want. Get yourself some food too. Buy your daughter and son some new clothes if they need them. School supplies, whatever they need. Mr. Thompson, I can't possibly—" "Grace, please." He sat down again and looked directly at her. "Let me do this one decent thing, just one. You've been working for me for 3 years and I've been blind the entire time. I didn't see you. I didn't ask questions. I didn't care enough to notice that someone in my own house was suffering. So please take the money. Take the card. Get yourself and your children somewhere safe and warm for a few days." Grace's hands trembled as she reached for the cash. She folded it carefully and held it against her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. Then she looked at the credit card and fresh tears started falling. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You don't have to thank me. I should be apologizing to you." After Grace left, Richard sat alone in his kitchen for a long time. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, hitting the marble countertops and expensive appliances. Everything in this room probably cost more than what Grace made in 5 years. He'd never thought about that before. He'd never thought about a lot of things. He spent the rest of the day doing something he'd never done. He started looking into the details of how his household ran. He pulled files, made phone calls, asked questions he should have asked years ago. And what he discovered made him feel sicker with every passing hour. Grace wasn't the only person working for him in terrible conditions. His gardening crew were all independent contractors with no benefits, paid by the job rather than by the hour. Some weeks they made decent money. Other weeks, when it rained or when Richard traveled and didn't need their services, they made nothing. No security, no stability, no safety net. His pool cleaner was in the same situation. So was the woman who detailed his cars twice a month, the man who did repairs around the house, all of them classified as contractors. So Richard's household management company could avoid paying benefits, health insurance, or payroll taxes. It was all perfectly legal. That's what his household manager had told him when she set everything up years ago. It was cost-effective. It was how wealthy families operated. It was smart business, but Richard couldn't stop thinking about Grace eating grass on his lawn. He couldn't stop thinking about her kids sleeping in a car, and he started wondering how many of the other people who worked for him were one emergency away from the same situation. That evening, he called Patricia, his household manager. She'd been handling all the staffing for his home for 6 years, and he'd always been happy to let her deal with the details while he focused on his business. "Patricia, I need to understand something," he said when she answered. "Why is Grace paid as an independent contractor instead of an employee?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well, it's standard practice, Mr. Thompson. Most high-net-worth households structure things this way. It saves on taxes and benefits costs, and it gives you more flexibility if you need to make changes." Changes meaning firing people without consequence? Another pause. That's one way to put it. But really, it's just good financial management. You're already very generous with your hourly rates compared to most people in your income bracket. Grace has been asking for full-time status with benefits for over a year. I found her request in the files. Why wasn't I told about this? Patricia sighed. Because it's not financially advisable, Mr. Thompson. Adding full-time employees with benefits significantly increases your household costs. I handle these matters so you don't have to worry about them. That's what you pay me for. Richard felt anger rising in his chest. What I pay you for is to run my household, not to keep information from me. Grace has 2 children. She's been living in her car for 3 weeks because she couldn't afford rent after paying for her son's emergency room visit. Did you know that? Silence. Then, no, I didn't know the specifics of her personal situation. Employees generally don't share those details because they're afraid they'll be fired if they complain about not making enough money. Mr. Thompson, I understand you're upset, but this is how the system works. If you start paying significantly above market rate and providing benefits that other households don't offer, you'll set an unsustainable precedent. These workers know the terms when they accept positions. Nobody forced them to work for you. Right, Richard said coldly, because people who are desperate for work have so many options. He ended the call and sat in his study, staring at his walls lined with awards and photographs from charity galas. He'd given millions to various causes over the years: education programs, medical research, arts funding. He'd been praised in newspapers and magazines for his generosity. He had plaques thanking him for his philanthropy, but the woman who cleaned his bathroom couldn't afford to eat. The disconnect was so obvious now that he couldn't believe he'd missed it for so long. The next day, Richard did something else he'd never done. He went to meet Grace's children. She'd texted him the name of the hotel where they were staying, a modest place near the highway. Nothing fancy, but it had clean rooms and a small breakfast area. When Richard knocked on the door, Grace answered looking different than he'd ever seen her. She was wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her uniform. Her hair was down instead of pulled back. She looked younger, more relaxed, even though he could still see the worry in her eyes. "Mr. Thompson, you didn't have to come here," she said, surprised. "I wanted to meet your kids, if that's okay." Grace hesitated, then opened the door wider. Inside, 2 children were sitting on one of the beds doing homework. The girl looked up first. She had her mother's eyes and a careful, watchful expression that made her seem older than 14. The boy was smaller, thinner, with glasses that were held together with tape on one side. "Kids, this is Mr. Thompson," Grace said quietly. "He's the man I work for." Both children stood up immediately, polite and uncertain. The girl offered her hand to shake, very formal. "It's nice to meet you, sir." Richard shook her hand, then the boys. "What are your names?" "I'm Destiny," the girl said. "And this is my brother, Kevin. It's nice to meet you both." "Your mom tells me you're good students," Kevin nodded. "I like math. And Destiny is really good at writing." Richard looked around the hotel room. It was small, with 2 double beds and a tiny table. There were textbooks spread out on one bed, a few bags of groceries on the table, and a couple of shopping bags in the corner that probably held new clothes. This room, basic as it was luxury compared to sleeping in a car. "How long were you living in your car?" he asked, then immediately wondered if that was too direct. But Destiny answered without hesitation. 22 days. We kept count." She said it matter-of-factly, like she was reporting a math problem, but Richard saw her hand reach over and squeeze her little brother's shoulder protectively. "That must have been really hard." "Mom made it okay," Kevin said. She always makes things okay. Richard looked at Grace, who was standing near the door with her arms wrapped around herself. She looked embarrassed and proud at the same time. These kids loved her. They trusted her. And she'd been breaking herself apart trying to keep them safe and fed and in school. "I need to tell you all something," Richard said, sitting down in the room's only chair so he was at eye level with the kids. "Your mom is one of the hardest working people I've ever met, and I haven't been paying her what she deserves. I haven't been treating her fairly, and I'm going to fix that." Destiny's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicious. What does that mean? Smart kid, Richard thought. She'd probably learned not to trust promises from adults. It means your mom is going to have a real job from now on, not a contractor. An actual employee with health insurance and benefits and a salary that she can count on. And it means you won't have to sleep in your car anymore. Kevin's eyes went wide. Really? Really. Grace made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Mr. Thompson, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he said firmly. He stood up and looked at her directly. "I absolutely do. And this is just the beginning." The following week, Richard did something that surprised everyone who knew him. He canceled all his meetings and spent 3 entire days working from home. Not in his usual way of conference calls and emails, but actually paying attention to how his house operated. He watched as the gardening crew arrived at 7 in the morning. 3 men who worked quickly and efficiently, finishing the lawn and hedges in less than 2 hours. He'd never really looked at them before. Now he saw the worn-out truck they drove, the patched clothes, the way they brought their own water bottles because nobody had ever offered them anything from the house. Richard walked outside and introduced himself properly for the first time. The oldest man, probably in his 50s, looked shocked that the homeowner was talking to him directly. "How long have you been taking care of my yard?" Richard asked. "About 4 years, sir," the man replied, still looking uncomfortable. "And how much do you get paid for each visit?" The man glanced at his crew members, unsure if this was some kind of test. "We get $150 per visit, sir. Split 3 ways." Richard did the math in his head. $50 each for 2 hours of hard physical labor, and that was only if the weather was good. If it rained, they didn't come and didn't get paid. If Richard traveled and canceled, same thing. "Do you work other houses too?" he asked. "Yes, sir. We try to do 8 or 10 houses a week if we can get them. Sometimes more. What happens if you get sick or injured?" The man looked down at his hands. "Then we don't work, and we don't eat." Richard thanked them and went back inside, his mind churning. He'd been thinking about Grace's situation as unique, a terrible exception. But now he was starting to see it was actually the rule. The people who made his comfortable life possible were all living on the edge of disaster. One accident or illness away from losing everything. He called his accountant that afternoon. "I want to restructure how I pay my household staff, everyone. I want them all to be full employees with benefits." His accountant was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be expensive, Richard. We're talking health insurance, payroll taxes, workers' compensation, paid time off. Your household cost could double." "I don't care about the cost, but I don't care," Richard repeated firmly. "Make it happen. And I want it done right. No cutting corners. Full benefits, living wages, the whole thing." Over the next few days, Richard met with every person who worked for him. His pool cleaner, who it turned out had diabetes and was rationing his insulin because he couldn't afford it. The woman who cleaned his cars, who was supporting her elderly mother and could barely keep up with medical bills. The handyman who did repairs, who had a daughter in college and was drowning in student loan debt. Each conversation was like peeling back another layer of reality he'd never seen before. These people were all working hard, sometimes multiple jobs, and still struggling. They were all just a few bad breaks away from the same situation Grace had been in. Richard started making changes immediately. He converted everyone to full-time employees with salaries that were nearly double what they'd been making as contractors. He set up health insurance. He created paid vacation and sick leave policies. His household manager quit when he insisted on these changes, calling them financially irresponsible and warning him that other wealthy families would think he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. But Richard didn't care what other people thought anymore. He also helped Grace find an apartment. Not just any apartment, but a real 2-bedroom place in a safe neighborhood near her kids' school. When she'd tried to protest that she couldn't afford it, Richard had co-signed the lease and paid the first 6 months of rent. Up front. Consider it back pay for. The 3 years you worked for me while I wasn't paying you. Enough, he'd said. Grace had cried. Again. She seemed to cry a lot these days, but Richard noticed they were different tears now. Not tears of desperation and shame, but tears of relief and disbelief that things could actually get better. But even as Richard made these changes in his own household, he couldn't stop thinking about the bigger picture. He'd fixed things for the handful of people who worked directly for him. But what about everyone else? What about all the other housekeepers and gardeners and service workers who were still trapped in the same system? One evening, Richard was having dinner with an old friend from college, another businessman who'd done well for himself. Richard started talking about what he'd learned, about Grace eating grass on his lawn, about the pool cleaner rationing insulin. His friend listened politely, then shook his head. That's tough, Richard. Really tough. But you can't fix poverty by yourself. These are complicated problems with complicated causes. Are they, though? Richard asked. Or is that just what we tell ourselves so we don't have to feel bad about it? What do you mean? I mean, my housekeeper was starving. It's not complicated. She wasn't being paid enough to live on. That's simple. The solution is also simple. Pay her more. His friend laughed uncomfortably. But if everyone starts paying their workers significantly more, where does it end? You could pay someone $100,000 a year, and they'd still want more. People always want more. Richard set down his fork. Grace didn't want more. She just wanted enough. Enough to feed her kids. Enough to keep a roof over their heads. Enough to go to the doctor when her son couldn't breathe. That's not greed. That's basic human dignity. I hear what you're saying, but you're being emotional about this. Business has to be practical. No, Richard said quietly. I was being practical before. I was practical when I paid the minimum I could get away with. I was practical when I kept people as contractors so I didn't have to pay benefits. I was practical while someone who worked in my house every single day was eating grass because she was so hungry. That's what practical got me. The conversation ended awkwardly, and Richard drove home thinking about that word. Practical. It was the word everyone used to justify paying people poverty wages. It was practical. It was cost-effective. It was smart business. But there was nothing smart about a system where people who worked full-time couldn't afford food. There was nothing practical about families sleeping in cars while the people they worked for lived in mansions. Richard started looking into his companies with the same critical eye he'd turned on his household. His business empire included a chain of warehouses, several office buildings, and a technology platform that connected buyers and sellers. Thousands of people worked in jobs connected to his companies in some way. He discovered the same patterns everywhere. The custodial staff who cleaned his office buildings were contractors with no benefits. The warehouse workers were paid minimum wage with impossible productivity quotas. The customer service representatives worked from home with no job security, and pay that varied wildly from week to week. All of it was legal. All of it was standard practice. All of it was slowly crushing the people at the bottom, while the people at the top got richer. Richard called an emergency meeting with his executive team. He laid out what he'd learned and what he wanted to change. The reaction was not positive. If we increase wages and add benefits across the board, we'll lose our competitive advantage, his CFO warned. Other companies will undercut us on price. Our shareholders will revolt, another executive added. They expect certain profit margins. We could lose contracts. Clients will go with cheaper competitors. Richard listened to all the objections. They were probably right. Making these changes would affect profits. It would make his companies less competitive in the short term. It might even upset investors. Let me ask you something, Richard said when everyone was finished. How many of you have ever been hungry? Really hungry? Not I skipped lunch hungry. Actually not sure where your next meal is coming from hungry? The room was silent. I watched my housekeeper eat grass from my lawn because she was starving. She has 2 kids who were sleeping in a car, while working for me, while I was making millions. So I don't care about profit margins right now. I care about making sure that nobody who works for any company I own has to choose between food and rent. Nobody has to ration their medicine. Nobody has to sleep in their car. Richard, you're being emotional. Yes, I am, he interrupted. I'm emotional because I saw something that broke my heart and opened my eyes. And now I can't unsee it. So we're going to make changes. Real changes. And if that means we make less profit, so be it. If that means shareholders complain, let them complain. If that means I have to use my own money to make up the difference, I'll do it. His executives looked at each other uncertain. Some seemed skeptical. Some seemed worried. But a few, Richard noticed, looked relieved. Like maybe they'd been waiting for someone to say out loud what they'd been thinking all along. We start with wages, Richard continued. Everyone who works for us or any contractor we hire gets paid a living wage. Not minimum wage, a wage they can actually live on. Then we look at benefits, job security, working conditions, everything. We're going to build a different kind of company. This is going to cost millions, the CFO said. I have millions, Richard replied. What good is having money if people are suffering while working for me? After the meeting ended and everyone left, Richard sat alone in the conference room. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. He knew people would criticize him. Some would say he was being foolish. Some would say he was virtue signaling or trying to buy good publicity. But every time he doubted himself, he thought about Grace on her knees, eating grass. He thought about Destiny and Kevin doing homework by flashlight in the back of a car. He thought about all the invisible people who kept the world running while barely surviving themselves, and he knew he had to try. 6 months had passed since that afternoon, when Richard saw Grace eating grass on his lawn. 6 months that had changed everything about how he saw the world and his place in it. The changes he'd made weren't popular with everyone. Some of his business partners had stopped returning his calls. A few investors had pulled out, calling his new policies unsustainable and bad for business. There were articles in business magazines questioning whether he'd lost his edge, whether he'd gone soft, whether his companies could survive with these new expense structures. Richard read the criticism and felt nothing but a strange sense of peace. Let them talk. Let them think whatever they wanted. He knew what mattered. Grace's transformation was the most visible sign of the changes. She'd gained weight, healthy weight that made her face glow and her eyes bright. She smiled more easily now, laughed at jokes, seemed lighter somehow. She still worked for Richard, but on completely different terms. She had a salary that let her save money for the first time in years. She had health insurance that covered her and both kids. She had paid vacation time, which she'd used to take Destiny and Kevin to the beach for a weekend. I'd never seen the ocean before, she told Richard one morning. Can you believe that? 46 years old and I'd never seen the ocean. The kids loved it. Kevin collected shells for hours. Richard found himself looking forward to these conversations. Grace wasn't just his employee anymore. She was someone he respected, someone whose opinion he valued, someone who'd taught him more about life in 6 months than he'd learned in 54 years. Her kids were thriving too. Destiny had joined the debate team at school and was talking about college, something that had seemed impossible when they were living in a car. Kevin's asthma was under control, now that they could afford his medications. He'd even made the honor roll last semester. But Richard's impact went beyond just one family. The workers in his companies were seeing changes too. The warehouse employees now made $18 an hour instead of minimum wage, with health benefits and reasonable productivity quotas. The custodial staff were full employees with job security and retirement plans. The customer service representatives had stable salaries and proper equipment to work from home. Some of his competitors mocked these changes. Others watched quietly, waiting to see if Richard's companies would fail. But something unexpected happened instead. Worker turnover dropped dramatically. Productivity went up. Customer satisfaction improved. When people felt valued and secure, they worked better. They cared more. They stayed longer. Richard started getting emails from employees he'd never met. A warehouse worker in Ohio who could finally afford to take his daughter to the dentist. A cleaning woman in Texas who'd been able to help her grandson with college tuition. Small stories that added up to something bigger. Liv's actually getting better because of choices he'd made. He started a foundation, but not the kind he'd been involved with before. This wasn't about charity galas and tax write-offs. It was about advocating for real policy changes, living wage laws, affordable health care, worker protections. He used his platform and his money to push for the kind of systemic changes that could help millions of people, not just the ones who worked directly for him. Other wealthy people thought he was betraying his class. At a fundraising dinner, a billionaire he'd known for years pulled him aside. "What are you doing, Richard? You're making the rest of us look bad." "Good," Richard replied. "Maybe we should look bad. Maybe we should feel uncomfortable. You can't change the whole system by yourself, maybe not. but I can change my part of it. And if enough people do that, maybe the whole system changes." The man shook his head and walked away. Richard watched him go and felt no regret. He was done pretending that everything was fine just because it was fine for him. One evening, Richard decided to host a dinner at his house. Not a business dinner or a networking event. Just a simple meal with the people who'd taught him the most important lessons of his life. He invited Grace and her kids, the gardening crew, his pool cleaner, the woman who'd cleaned his cars for years. He invited the warehouse supervisor from his Ohio facility, who'd been advocating for better conditions before Richard even started listening. He invited everyone who'd been invisible to him for so long. His chef prepared a feast, and for the first time in the history of that mansion, the dining room felt truly full. Not with rich people making small talk, but with real people sharing real stories. Kevin talked excitedly about his science fair project. Destiny described her debate tournament. The pool cleaner's wife talked about going back to school now that they had stable income and health insurance. The gardener's son had just graduated high school and was starting trade school. Richard sat at the head of his long table and looked around at these faces. A year ago, he wouldn't have been able to name half the people in this room. Now he knew their stories, their struggles, their dreams. He knew how hard they worked. He knew what they'd overcome. And he was humbled by their resilience and grace. After dinner, Grace found him standing on the back patio, looking out at the lawn, where he'd first seen her eating grass. She stood beside him quietly for a moment. "You know what's funny?" she said finally. "I used to pray for a miracle. I used to pray that something would change, that life would get easier, that I'd catch a break. I never imagined the miracle would look like this." "What do you mean?" Richard asked. "I mean, most miracles in stories come from magic or luck or winning the lottery. But this miracle came from someone just deciding to see me, really see me, and then deciding to care about what they saw. That's a different kind of miracle, the kind that's actually possible in real life." Richard felt his throat tighten. "I should have seen you sooner. I should have cared sooner." "Maybe," Grace said gently. "But you see me now, and you're doing something about it. That matters more than you know." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the evening settle over the garden. In the house behind them, people were laughing and talking. Destiny was showing Kevin's science project to one of the gardeners who was genuinely interested. The warehouse supervisor was swapping recipes with the chef. Connection and conversation happening across lines that usually kept people separate. "Can I tell you something?" Grace asked. "That day you saw me eating the grass, I was so ashamed I wanted to disappear. I thought my life was over. I thought I'd lost everything, including my dignity. But looking back now, that was the day everything changed. That was the day you finally saw what was right in front of you." "I wish it hadn't taken something so terrible for me to wake up," Richard admitted. "Sometimes that's how it works, though. Sometimes we don't see what we need to see until something breaks our heart wide open. The important thing is what we do after that." Richard nodded. "I'm trying to do better. To be better. You are better. And you're helping other people be better too. Do you know how many companies are watching what you're doing? How many workers are sending your story to their bosses and saying, 'Why can't we do this?' You started something bigger than just fixing your own house." "It's not enough," Richard said. "There are still millions of people working full-time and struggling. The system is still broken. You're right. It's not enough. But it's more than there was before. And more is how change happens. Not all at once. Not perfectly. Just more and more people deciding that things need to be different." Behind them, the door opened and Kevin came running out. "Mom, Destiny says it's time to cut the cake. Mr. Thompson, you have to come see it." "It's huge." Grace laughed and ruffled her son's hair. Richard followed them back inside, back to the warmth and noise and life happening in his house. As he walked through the door, he caught his reflection in the window. He looked older than he had 6 months ago, more tired maybe, but also more alive, more connected to the world around him. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Richard walked back out to the garden. He stood where he'd parked his car that afternoon 6 months ago. He looked at the spot on the lawn where Grace had been kneeling, eating grass because she was so hungry she had no other choice. The grass had grown back, of course. You couldn't tell anymore where it had happened. But Richard would never forget. He would carry that image with him forever, not as a source of shame, but as a reminder. A reminder that suffering often happens right in front of us while we're looking the other way. A reminder that we have more power to help than we usually admit. A reminder that seeing people, Really seeing them is the first step toward making things better. He thought about Grace's words. Sometimes it takes having your heart broken open to finally see clearly. Maybe that was true. Maybe that's what had happened to him. His comfortable bubble had burst, and now he couldn't go back to not knowing, not caring, not acting. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. There would always be more to do, more people to help, more systems to change. But that was okay. Richard had finally learned the most important lesson of his life. Having money didn't make him rich. Using it to help others did. Seeing people like Grace, hearing their stories, fighting to make their lives better, that was what gave his wealth meaning. He'd spent his whole life building an empire. Now he was learning how to build something better. A world where hard work was actually rewarded, where people didn't have to choose between medicine and food, where children could do homework at tables instead of by flashlight in cars, where nobody had to eat grass just to survive another day. It was ambitious, maybe impossible, but Richard had learned something else too. Impossible things start with one person deciding to try. One person seeing a problem and refusing to look away. One person choosing compassion over comfort. He'd been that person once. Driving up his driveway, seeing Grace on the lawn, and deciding to care about what he saw. Now he just had to keep being that person, every single day for the rest of his life, and that, Richard realized as he walked back toward his house, was exactly what he intended to do.